Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday, and I would also like to start off here by mentioning and congratulating the world entirely on today is the 75th anniversary of VE Day, also known as Victory in Europe Day, which occurred on this day, May 8th, back in 1945, which officially marked the end of World War II in Europe as Nazi Germany officially surrendered and laid down its arms. The Nazi German state is extinct, once and for all. Unfortunately, this would not end the war entirely, due to the factor that the Axis power of Imperial Japan would continue to fight on until August, until the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then Japan would finally surrender on September 2nd, which of course we will have a separate thing for that day when it comes. Now today will be a two-part kind of event. I will do this regular history video just to explain the history behind this day, and then later this evening I will be having a smaller, shorter length video just giving our greatest thanks to all of our veterans who took part in that war, no matter what theater they were in, and we will repeat this process again in September when that time comes as well. But so this will be the history video, and I will have a smaller gratification thanks video at a later time today in this evening, since that was the point in time that the official big announcement was made by the Allied nations governments that the war was finally over in Europe. So this is the history portion. We will discuss exactly what led to this historic day, this much awaited day, this end of horror in Europe day, I should say, because we all know the Nazis did a lot of terrible things, and unfortunately, we cannot go back in time and reverse what they did. I wish to God that we could, but we cannot. Anyway, today is still a day. It's a day for celebration. And in memory of this day, we shall go and look here at the history of this event. We have the handy-dandy little history notebook, and we have a couple of little images here to display and give graphic visuals. Not graphic visuals, but visuals. But we will go through here and start off. I will probably not make any announcements for the following week in this video, so just keep in line with the World War II victory here in Europe theme. This is a day for celebration across not just my country here in the United States, but across every nation on this planet that took a stand against tyranny and fascism. So where does this all start here? What we got to look at is prior to May 8th, and the war in Europe is really coming down. Now, I mentioned that the Battle of Berlin had been fought in late April. I mentioned this in the comments section. I don't know if anyone ever saw this in the main channel page. And I canceled my video on that because there just wasn't enough information that I could, at my disposal. I'm sure it is out there. I just had no access to it. So we just kind of converge it into this shortly. And it's not really a lot of detail other than the fact the Battle of Berlin, by the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was very clear it was just a matter of when was it going to surrender, because it was going to lose the war. It was done. The war was on its back end. All the remaining Axis powers were. Japan was on the same ropes in the Pacific. Well, during April, starting about April 20th, I believe, the Soviet Red Army did storm in, started to besiege the German capital of Berlin, which is still Germany's capital today. And, of course, this went on for roughly 2.5 weeks, if not 3 weeks, until May 2nd, and that was when the city was finally taken. Now, during the midst of all this, Hitler was in Berlin. He had refused to evacuate out of the city. He was delusional. He thought there was going to be a new wonder weapon, or Nazi scientists were going to have a new kind of super soldier, and it was all deluded fantasies of his. None of it was ever going to happen. He was just thinking out of his mind. It wasn't until about 2 days before that he finally consigned that it's done. And Hitler began to fear in his mind being captured by the Soviets, because the Russians, allow me to put this into context here, when the final push to make into Germany occurred in early 1945, many of these Germans actually were fleeing west just to surrender, purposely to surrender to the British and the Americans, because the British and Americans, they were taking them as prisoners of war. They were following the standard procedures. Well, the Russians, or the Soviets back then, they weren't so kind. If a German tried to surrender to them, more than often they would just shoot them. They didn't care. They would shoot them. There was many incidences where the Soviet Red Army would liberate areas from German occupation, and well, not German occupation, it's in Germany now, but they would liberate German towns. They would kill all the men in there, and then at times they'd even rape all the women, and sometimes they'd even kill some of the children. It was mostly because the Soviets. It wasn't exactly because they're all-consuming evil. I mean, it was a bad thing to do, but we got to understand the Soviet viewpoint just a little bit here, and that's the factor that when Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, he had given the German armies moving through the Soviet Union strict orders that not only were they to round up and kill Jews and Romas and homosexuals and the typical people that we attribute to the Holocaust, but he also gave them orders that any Soviets captured were either be shot or they were to be put to the death camp, or, and if they were lucky, they would be used as slave labor until they literally died from exhaustion. He had no respect. The Nazis had no respect for the Soviets because they hated communism. They were anti-Bolsheviks, anti-communists, and they gave no respect to them. And this is large part, although we don't exactly have kind relations with Russia today, we do have to at least give them credit because the Russians did bore the brunt of Nazi Germany's onslaught against killing people. They suffered more civilian casualties than any other nation did, and they suffered a lot of military casualties as well. Not to mention that if you surrendered to the Nazi Germans and you actually escaped, well, you weren't going to be welcomed back to Soviet arms because of the factor that if you surrendered to the Germans, Joseph Stalin, who was in power at that time in the Soviet Union, he basically decreed that you were a traitor if you surrendered, and if you returned, you would be shot dead. Yeah, pretty. Well, because of this, and because of the brutality that they had received when the Germans invaded their country, the Soviets, they felt no reason why they shouldn't return the favor to the Germans now that they're on their soil. As attributed in some instances, and including in some video games even as well, there's been the call that Soviets would kind of somewhat use a phrase that's similar to, it's now their land, it's their people, and it's their blood. They were trying to get retribution in a way to just think, well, they killed dozens of hundreds of millions of our people, now we're going to do it to you. I mean, it's not exactly the best form of retribution, but I can understand some of the pain and logic that they had in making that decision. And in some ways, I don't blame them, but in other ways, I definitely do see it's not appropriate. It should still not have been done, but I can definitely see where and why they did so. Well, because of the brutality of the Russians that are now invading Germany and taking over a large part of the eastern parts, there were, I'm not just talking thousands, I'm talking millions of not just German soldiers, but German civilians who are fleeing west because they are going to surrender to the Americans, British, because they fear surrendering to the Russians, because they fear they're going to be killed, which they probably would be. Well, Hitler refuses to evacuate Berlin when the Soviets, we're going to call them Soviets, that's what they were at the time. Well, he refuses to evacuate Berlin because of his delusional fantasies, and eventually he comes to the conclusion on April 28th that it's over for him. And he begins to fear himself being captured by the Russians, knowing that if he's captured, before he's killed, he'll probably be tortured, he'll probably be beaten, he'll probably be humiliated. Because the Russians will take him, they will not hesitate to kill Hitler. They really would not. I'm not even sure that us Americans and British would have hesitated to do so. But he realizes this. And the next day, April 29th, Hitler marries his longtime mistress/friend, Eva Braun, who she had kind of loved him for years, but he just decided to marry her at the last moment. And the very next day, Hitler he was in his Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellor's building. The Soviets are literally just blocks away, like you can hear the gunfire and the tanks coming nearer, and Hitler in the bunker. Him and his wife go into a room. They lock the door. His wife takes a cyanide pill. She's dead within minutes. Hitler takes a cyanide pill and then proceeds to take his pistol and shoot himself in the head. He's now dead. The Fuhrer is dead. Now, before Hitler had died, he had instructed his guards to remove his body, to cremate it, which was actually put in a testimony, which we're going to list here in a second. The guards proceeded to take the two bodies out of the room. They took them outside while there's still gunfire, and they proceeded to drop the bodies out on top of the pavement, douse them in kerosene, and then light them ablaze, and then flee after they had burnt. The Soviets did identify Hitler's remains. I mean, there's conspiracy theories that Hitler did die, but supposedly, from what I know, the Soviets did find the remains, and they were only able to identify it as Hitler's by the dental records. That's how well supposedly burnt these were. But then again, these were the Soviets, so you can agree to disagree if that's true or not. So, that's a whole nother topic. I'm not wanting to dwell on that too much. Anyway, prior to Hitler's death, this is on April 30th that he commits suicide, and Berlin is surrendered 2 days later on May 2nd. Prior to his death, Hitler had written a testament that was to be given out to the German Nazi authorities here. And in this testament, his body was to be cremated. He gave them the instructions how to dispose of his body. He expressed thanks to the loyal German citizens that had remained loyal to the Nazi regime and appealed to them to continue the war after his death. And he named two of his closest associates, Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Goering, were traitors, because Goering had actually kind of signaled weeks or days before that he was interested in taking Hitler's place if he killed him, or if he ended up being dead or succeeding him, and Hitler was furious at this. And, of course, he had been like best friends with him for a while, and all of a sudden he turned on them both, and he said, nope, they're traitors. And he did two other things. He denied any charges of warmongering, which I hate to tell you, Mr. Adolf. Oh, wait, I better do something here. Adolf, I don't know if you can hear me down there, but guess what? You warmongered. Yeah, we all know where he is. I don't know if he can actually hear me down there. I hope he's getting the pitchfork in him right now. And, of course, the final thing that Hitler did, he kind of placed a series of succession. Since he had eliminated Goering and Himmler as his successors, he named Admiral Karl Dönitz with the title of Reich President. He was to succeed Hitler as the leader of the German government, not as the Führer, but as the Reich President. That way, no other person in the German government would ever have the same title that Hitler himself had been given. Dönitz immediately received word of this after Hitler's death. He began preparations to try to form a government, but unfortunately, we have some military matters that develop that kind of go wrong for him. If anything could not go wrong at this point for the Germans. Excuse me. On May 2nd, of course, as we mentioned, Berlin fell. It surrendered to the Red Army that was being led by Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. American and Soviet forces also around the same day had joined together at Torgau on the Elbe River, and they had effectively cut the areas still in German control in half. They split them in two. And to really describe to you what that is here, we're going to show an image here in a very small second. The pockets of German forces now that are what's left of the German army is now basically in occupied territories that's mostly what's left, but they're large pockets, but they're not even on German territory. The largest pockets are on occupied territory. Dönitz, he meets with what remains of the German High Command under Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel in the town of Flensburg, which is near the German-Danish border. And on May 2nd, he does form a new official government. Dönitz claimed that this government was unpolitical. He claimed there was no association with any past political regime in Germany. Unfortunately for Donitz, the Allies didn't see this as true because of the factor he did no attempt to basically reject Nazism. The Nazi Party was not banned. No Nazi officials were rounded up and arrested, and on top of that, Nazi symbols weren't even removed. He's still allowing Nazism to thrive in Germany, even though he's claiming it's unpolitical. So really, it's not that big. It's not unpolitical, Donuts. It's still Nazi. At this point, unfortunately for the Germans, they only had control of small pockets, as we mentioned, and these pockets include the following areas. There were several ports in France and Greece. They still had areas in Greece, but these are islands that they held. At France, they still held Dunkirk and Lorient. There's many other ports they control, but I gave two. There's other islands in Greece they control. In Greece, they control the island of Crete and Rhodes, and land area that the Germans actually still happen to control. They still control southern Norway, Denmark, all of Denmark, all of Austria, western Holland, which is also known as the Netherlands, northern Prussia, which is just northern Germany near the city of Hamburg, which, yes, people, Hamburg is where the word hamburgers came from. I'm serious, that's where it came from. And also in southern Bavaria, which is basically southern Germany today. It's a German state. And they also still had pockets of troops in northern Italy and Croatia, which is in the Balkan Peninsula near Serbia, if anyone knows where that is. And if you don't know where that is, it's south of Hungary and Austria. I'm sure you can pinpoint where that is. Kind of describe here, as we describe this, what was going on. Here is a map of the German-held positions by this point in early May 1945, after Hitler's death, in the blue. The blue is what the Germans still have. Yeah, not much. They have, like, right here is Bavaria. You can go up here, northern Italy. They have a little bit Austria here. They have maybe a pocket. Croatia's, like, right here. Denmark, of course, they still have. A little bits of northern Germany up here. Norway, they still have in control of a small pocket up here near, I think, Latvia, which, of course, the Red Army's going to take care of them. And down here in Greece, like this little small blue sliver on Crete, near another one here that they have. They really just don't have much by the end of the war. I don't know why they're continuing to fight. This can go for a while. In the following days, several German armies did end up, and their commanders did end up surrendering to the Allies in separate little surrender ceremonies. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who was very famous for having kind of obstructed the Allies' movement up through Italy since 1943. He's still in northern Italy at this point. Him and his troops, they surrender on May 2nd or 3rd, one of the two. On May 4th, the German forces in Denmark, the Netherlands, and northwest Germany, they surrender on orders from Donitz's government itself. On May 5th, German forces in Bavaria and southwest Germany also surrender. So basically, they're surrendering front by front, but there's still fronts that exist. There's still the ones over here in Austria that exist. There's still the ones in Norway. There's still the ones in Crete. It's just a mess. And eventually, on May 6th, Donitz thinks he's doing well. He's surrendering to the Allies because he realizes there's no hope for Nazi Germany to continue the war. He realizes this. Well, unfortunately, it isn't going so well for the Allies. The Allies don't like this little bit by bit. On May 6th, Donitz receives word from his personal representative, Admiral Friedberg, that the Allied Supreme Commander, American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who later will become our 34th president during the 1950s, he was insisting on the immediate and unconditional surrender of all German forces on all the remaining fronts. He wants them all surrendered at once. Donitz sends General Alfred Jodl, or Jodl, I don't know how to pronounce that, but we'll do Jodl, to the French city of Reims, which has been liberated by the Allies. He tries to persuade Eisenhower to accept the front-by-front surrender, not a general unconditional surrender, which is even worse off. Eisenhower, he doesn't buy it. And he basically states to the Germans that you're either going to surrender by midnight on May 8th. I'll give you a couple days to make your decision here. I give you till midnight on May 8th. You don't surrender, not only am I going to shut off any chance of surrender talks with us in Britain, but I'm also going to resume the bombing campaign. Take your pick. Basically, Eisenhower is saying, you have lost. Either surrender it all now, or we can continue this until you're dead. I'm not playing games. Of course, Jodl is alarmed by this, and he does telegram Dönitz to tell him what Eisenhower is saying. And Dönitz for once, he listens to reason, and he gives Jodl but he gives him the orders to go ahead and sign the unconditional surrender that they're wanting. This is on May 7th. But he also asks him to ask for a 48-hour delay in the actual signing, in the effect, not in the signing, a 48-hour delay from the time of the signing to the actual time it would take effect, and not so that he can resume a war, but Dönitz claimed so that he could try to relay the message that they were surrendering at this given point to the dispersed and widely distributed German forces across what's left of Europe. Since they're so scattered, it would take time to let them know, oh, we're surrendering, do not fight after this point. If you do, it looks like we've defied the treaty, or surrender. The first instrument of surrender was signed at 2:41 a.m. Central European time, not here, which is like Germany time, on May 7th by the Allied commanders Walter Bedell Smith and Ivan Susloparov and General Jodl. Eisenhower agrees to put the 48-hour delay in a release. He agrees to do this, but he also agrees to delay the delay, because he agrees with the Soviet High Command that a separate text should be signed formally by German emissionaries at a time and place designated at the Allies' choosing. Because rendering that the Reims unconditional surrender was more of simply a ceasefire, kind of like an armistice, until we can get official surrender document formally signed. Well, within 6 hours after this, they really have to hurry up because of the fact that 6 hours after the Reims signing, the Soviet High Command comes in and they state that they will not deem that the act of surrender is acceptable. It's unacceptable to them because the Germans were not required to lay down their arms. The Germans were only required to cease hostilities and to remain in the territories they still had under their control. The Germans were not required to give up their arms or surrender. So, and Eisenhower sees the fault in this, and he does agree that, yes, this is true, we probably needed to correct this. And under advisement from the Soviets and his own advisors, he agrees to hold an official formal surrender signing on May 8th in the German capital of Berlin with Marshal Georgy Zhukov on that date. Now, Berlin was chosen because the Soviets actually are the ones that came up with this, and the factor they pointed out that the Reims surrender, even if it was taken as the official surrender, it had been signed on what had formerly been German-occupied territory. It was liberated territory. They said, you don't make an enemy surrender on territory that it conquered and made suffer. You make an enemy, basically, we need to make them sign it where this aggression began, and that began in Berlin. Don't make them sign where they took territory and made people suffer for it. You go ahead and you make them sign it on their home turf. And honestly, I must agree with that. I like it. So this is where the idea came to sign this in Berlin at. Dönitz uses the 48-hour delay that's created between the Riem signing and this. They decided to put the 48-hour delay in between. So Eisenhower allowed the Riem signing to have a 48-hour delay in the actual taking effect of this term, almost. Which would actually mean this was May 6th. I do apologize. The Riem signing was on May 6th, I believe. And unfortunately, or early May 6th. And he used the 48-hour delay to basically allow his troops to attack the Soviets. He ceases hostility with the West, but Donitz has no surrender thing with the Soviet Red Army, and he uses this time to continue to fight the Soviets, not in trying to fight back and try to retake territory, but to try to conserve what's left of the German army, to stop the Soviets from getting that, and to help that more of them come together and get west and get away from the Soviets. The following day, on May 8th, the big day comes. The formal surrender was signed in Berlin that day, in that morning, with the following signing representatives. For the USSR, or the Soviet Union, we have Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov of the Red Army, or the Soviet High Command. For Britain, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur William Tedder. France, General Jean de Latreille de Tuscany. I don't know how to really pronounce French, so I hope I pronounced it halfway decent. And we have, for the United States, we had General Carl Spaatz. Basically, as two little conditions here for this surrender here, and I'll get to the, well, hold on here, we got some German signatures, I better read them too. On the part of Germany, part of the surrender documents dictated that we needed all three branches of the German military forces to have a representative to sign this surrender document. And they decided to go ahead with this. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed for the Wehrmacht, or the German Army. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg signed for the Kriegsmarine, or the German Navy. General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf signed for the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force. And also, fun fact to put in here, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg was the one that signed for the Kriegsmarine, or the German Navy. Ironically, Karl Donitz, who is now the Reich president of the Frensburg government, that is not recognized by the Allies, by the way, he had been the head admiral of the German Navy. Donitz was actually the one responsible for the U-boat operations during the war in the Battle of the Atlantic. He was the submarine commander. He was the big submarine commander that orchestrated all that. So when we think of U-boats sinking in the Atlantic, just think of Donitz. If you don't want to remember for the 20-day tenure of the Reich president, which most of us don't remember him as the submarine commander during World War II for the Nazi Germans. Following the Riem signing here, at the Riem signing, which had taken place earlier, Eisenhower had maintained that a 36-hour news embargo blackout was to be maintained. This was simply to prevent the news from leaking out too early ahead of the signing in Berlin. They didn't want the public to really celebrate this until after the signing in Berlin, and they asked for a 36-hour news blackout. No reporters were allowed to publish their stories, and they were to be kept there, which most of them agreed to. Unfortunately, one little American reporter got out without them knowing that he had a story, and he leaked the news a day ahead of time. And this caused recognition on May 8th in the West, because the West they weren't going to celebrate the victory until May 9th, the day after, because also two terms here that we got to look at here. The one that's important to this news release was the factor that the German forces, although they had signed the surrender document on the morning of May 8th, the German forces were not required to actually surrender until 11:01 p.m. on that night. So, though that was signed, the war wasn't technically over until 11:01 p.m. And that's why they wanted it. So all these nations and that's why they were going to celebrate on May 9th, because it's already almost midnight. You might as well just celebrate it the next day. Well, because this news reporter leaked the news, everyone was celebrating on May 8th in Europe, even though the war was not officially, although the Germans had not officially laid down their arms until like late that night. But they were celebrating on May 8th. Now, this was only in the West. The Soviet Union and some of its allies in the East, they went ahead and they observed it on May 9th, which they continue to today. Here in the United States and the Western countries, such as Great Britain and France and Italy and Canada and all them, in Australia and New Zealand, we celebrate it on May 8th, while in the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Belarus, or no, wait, not that. Belarus. I do apologize for that. Belarus, Bulgaria, Russia, still, they celebrate it on May 9th as Victory Day. We in the United States and the West, we celebrate it as VE Day or Victory in Europe Day. May 8th, May 9th. Same thing, just a little mix up with the time because of one news reporter. But it basically, when the German forces laid down their arms at 11:01 p.m. that night, Nazi Germany was extinct. It was done. The war in Europe is over. Continue here. And also, I want to add this with the German surrender. Not only was it the end at 11:01, but there's a funny thing that they had to add. They added that no German vessel or ship could be scuttled or burned before that surrender. And why they did this was because at the end of World War I, the German Navy, Imperial Navy, had been taken and interred at Scapa, which is a British naval base, with their crews on them. Well, just before the Treaty of Versailles had been signed in June 1919, just a week or so ahead of that, or it may have been just days, the German crew were so outraged by that, as they knew that these ships were going to be given to the separate Allied nations basically as war rewards. They scuttled and sank their own ships in the harbor, in the thing. The British ships, they tried to intercept them, tried to stop them from sinking. Ultimately, every one of them about sank, and they even shot some of the German sailors for doing so. Well, the Allies were furious that this had happened to them. In fact, today, there's still German battleship wrecks in Scapa. You can go to Scapa, and they got markers. And some of them, they even go on their website. You can see the wreck photos that they've taken. You can even dive to them if you want. Well, because they were so outraged at the end of World War I that the Germans had scuttled their fleet, they intended full-heartedly, of course, to take those ships again in this war. So they were like, you do that in this is going to be violation, and you will not get your surrender. So they were just trying to say, okay, we know what you did in the last war. We want those ships. Don't scuttle them. When the surrender went into effect, of course, it's over. In Europe, Japan, it's not. In the Pacific, the war is still raging. Keep this in mind. Europe is done, but the war itself is not done, as we're only half done. We got one big power out. Now we got to get the last one, and that's the one that is doing kamikaze. Now, of course, of all the nations that there was only one nation that would be upset that Nazi Germany had surrendered, or at least be angry, and I'm pretty sure we know who that is. Imperial Japan, also known as the Japanese Empire. And of course, the Japanese Empire denounces the surrender because they seen surrender as a weakness. It was unworthy to surrender. You were better to die than surrender, of course, which was contributing to their prolongation of the war. And we'll get to that in September and August. And they denounced the surrender and they seized the German embassy in Tokyo. On May 23rd, the Flensburg government of Admiral Dönitz was officially dissolved by the Allies, and its constituents, its members, including Dönitz himself, were taken into custody as prisoners of war. And two little small factors here. In London, people were celebrating in all the Allied nations. People in France were celebrating, people in Great Britain, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, any country that had fought Germany. Even some Germans were happy because they saw it as liberation from an oppressive, brutalic regime. which if you were in East Germany, you weren't, well, you've been liberated by the Soviets, and things were about to get a heck lot worse. Anyway, in London, Winston Churchill, the great Prime Minister himself, came out onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace with King George VI, who was Queen Elizabeth II's dad, and they were greeting citizens from the balcony of the royal palace, just waving to them. And King George VI, he had his wife, Queen Elizabeth. Yes, his wife was named Elizabeth, and his daughter was named Elizabeth. And then, of course, he had two daughters, Elizabeth, who was still Queen of England. Yes, Queen Elizabeth was old enough that she was at VE Day. She was a teenager, I think. She might have been in her early 20s, but I'm pretty sure she was in her late teens. Anyway, her and her sister Margaret, who unfortunately has passed away too now. Yeah, because she's old. She's old. Anyway, they were out there on Buckingham Palace, and eventually they even let Margaret and Elizabeth go out into the crowd and celebrate with the rest of them, which was very unlike royals, but hey, we just fought the greatest war ever that we've ever had to face. So they went ahead and let them have some fun. In the United States, of course, the people of America were jubilant over the surrender. They were happy that the war was over. Unfortunately, we were reminded by President Harry Truman, who had taken office after FDR had passed away on April 12th of that year, roughly just about 3 weeks prior. We were reminded by him that the job was only half done. We still had Japan to fight. And also, Truman was very happy on that day. He didn't make it all doom and gloom, because it actually was his birthday, and he later was commented in life. Later in his life, saying that it was the best birthday he ever had. But he also expressed regret due to FDR. He had been so pivotal to America's efforts to get out of the Great Depression. As they went into the war, he had really led the country through over 10 years. Including through the war. He was the one that gave us hope when Pearl Harbor happened, and unfortunately he had died 3 weeks prior of a cerebral hemorrhage. And Harry Truman later made the remark that day that his only regret was that FDR had not lived long enough to see that day come, that he had not lived to see it. And I think a lot around the country were also sad. Even though we were celebrating, many of the flags in the country were still at half staff due to Truman's order that there was to be a 30-day half staff flags due in remembrance of FDR. So it was kind of also sad for the Americans. And then we were reminded that although we got victory in Europe, we still got more to go here. We still got to fight and get rid of Japan out of here. So that kind of concludes the history aspect. For images here, this is a picture of Mr. Karl Donitz, who was the admiral of the German Kriegsmarine and later Reich president for about 20 days. So this is him. This is an image of General, Wilhelm Keitel signing the surrender document in Berlin. He was a field marshal. Then, of course, here, I know that some of you probably think right now, you're probably thinking, Elizabeth is old. Well, I have confirmation for you that she's old. Because we can look in this photo. This wonderful little photo. Here's Winston Churchill. Here's King George VI. Here's Princess Margaret. Here's King George's wife, Elizabeth. And right over here is future Queen Elizabeth II. Yes, she was there. She is that old. But she has been a good queen. But yeah, she was there that day. And here we have an image in New York of VE Day and what it was like in New York City. And you can just see, even though we weren't in Europe, the people here in the United States, we were jubilant that Nazi Germany was done and surrendered. This was in New York. People were happy beyond all measure. Even if we had to face Japan, we had half the work cut out and done. So that concludes the history here of VE Day. So as you go forward today, be sure to thank a veteran. If you see one, I'm not saying you will, but if you do see one, give them thanks. Just even if you don't know them, just kindly go up to them. Just express your thanks to them for the part that they did. I don't care if they fought in Europe. I don't care if they fought in the Pacific. Either theater of war. They did a hero's job. This day, it's really a testimony to human nature, and it's a testimony to the sacrifice that humans have made. So, as you go about today, keep that in mind. That in the darkest hour that the world ever had, to this point, I think, it really was turned around by common men. I mean, there was governments, yes, but it was common men who, in Britain, in the United States, in France, in even Russia, who came up and did the duty, the call to arms. They took up that call and they fought, and they secured many, many years of future for the free world. Even in Russia. Even in Russia, because honestly, as bad as communism is, fascism, I think, was worse. It's the only government I classify as worse. Now, I will have the thank you video here, official little thank you video and little official thing later today and this coming evening, due to the factor that it wasn't until really the evening that the governments officially recognized it and they officially made their announcement. So I will do that later this evening, and I hope to see you all possibly get to take a look at that video. But if you do not, basically, my sincerest thanks right now to everyone that fought in World War II. You are the greatest generation that has lived, and you took a stand against Nazi tyranny, and you took a stand, and some of you took a stand against the oppression and aggression of the Japanese. So my greatest thanks out to you, as you've made our today possible through your actions back then. I will, of course, have the video up later, so until then, hopefully everyone on here has a continued great VE Day. Do take a moment to reflect if you can, and if you can, be sure to see the video when I post it later this afternoon. Have a good day, and God bless America, and God save the entire world from any future dictators that may run in line with what the Nazi regime did.